Hello and welcome to this video where I'm going to be responding to Xexizy's Why the Russian Revolution Failed. So, Xexizy begins his video by saying that Leninism advocates the state taking the means of production into their hands and then eventually giving it to the workers. However, this is a complete misrepresentation of Leninist theory. So, what Leninism actually advocates is that the workers control the state, and the state plans the economy for the workers. And this idea of the state giving the means of production to the workers, that doesn't even really make sense. Like, what would that even entail? Would the state just decentralize? Would the state allow the enterprises to be planned by the workers? Would the state allow the economy to be planned by the workers? How much decentralization would be entailed here? It's not very specified in the video, because it is very necessary for centralization to take place and to be present for proper planning and resource allocation, at least with modern technology. For this to be done on a decentralized base and completely done by the workers, it would be extremely inefficient because the workers can't possibly have all the information necessary to plan their own enterprises so that it is fluid with the constantly changing economy, especially in the consumer goods department. So then he claims that Stalinism, which I don't even consider an ideology, really. I guess it could be considered an ideology depending on who you talk to, but I would just refer to that as the Stalin era of the USSR. He says that Stalinism seeks to have the state hold the means of production. I also think that he might be referring to Marxism-Leninism just in general here. So he says that Marxist-Leninists want the state to always hold the means of production. However, if this were true, let's start with the idea that this happened in the USSR. So if this were true, then how come the workers did control their own enterprises? I mean, if Stalin wanted the state to control everything, then why would he even allow for things like collectivization or worker control? And why would he push for the party to decentralize and give more power to the Soviets, only to be turned down by the party because of fear of counter-revolutionaries entering the Soviets via elections, especially with fascism rising in Europe? So basically, Stalin wanted there to be more decentralization and wanted the Soviets to have more power, but that simply wasn't possible at the time. And Marxism-Leninism in no way advocates that the state always exists, because obviously the state would wither away as classes do. And that's pretty much what all Marxist theories suggest. I don't see why Marxism-Leninism is being singled out here, or perhaps he's just referring to the Stalin era, when in fact, if you read any biographies of Stalin, he too wanted the state to wither away, and he was not just some evil tyrant guy. I mean, even modern historians don't even see him as a dictator anymore. That's more just Cold War propaganda. So then, Xexizy claims that Leninism is intended to be in a capitalist country that is first world. However, this can really be refuted with a simple understanding of Leninist theory. To quote Lenin, "A revolution is impossible without a revolutionary situation. Furthermore, not every revolutionary situation leads to revolution." From this, we can deduce that Leninism does not intend there to be a revolution anywhere. Due to its scientific nature, it realizes that revolution can only occur where it's possible, and even at that, sometimes it doesn't. Because Leninism, or Marxism-Leninism, is a constantly changing and adapting science, it must be understood that there is no one view on how exactly a revolution will start, given that revolutions have historically started in many ways. But to also quote Lenin, revolution happened not where capitalism was the strongest, but where the bourgeoisie were the weakest. So it's basically saying that revolution really only happens where, the workers actually have a chance at overthrowing them, whereas in the first world, they really don't have a chance of overthrowing them. I'm not saying it's impossible, like third worldists would claim, but I'm just saying it's very unlikely. Next, Xexizy claims that because the majority of Russians were peasants, they therefore couldn't participate in democracy because of a lack of information, and this basically implies that there was little to no democracy in the USSR. However, the notion that people had no voice in the USSR is absurd, especially on top of the claim that they couldn't vote because they didn't know what was going on in the country, because that is really a problem for all democratic systems. And how the Soviets dealt with this is, and basically how they gave their people power, was they had Soviets at the local levels who basically ran, local little towns and stuff, and then they also had members who were appointed to more centralized Soviets, and then eventually the Supreme Soviet, which controlled more broad senses of economic and political development. And this is basically how they dealt with the problem of people not having, or people not having to control the entire state by themselves, because, you can't have direct democracy on literally everything, because that's inefficient, even as Xexizy admits in his own video. And, yeah, the local Soviets were controlled basically entirely by the people. And even the more centralized Soviets were also controlled by the people. However, a lot of the decisions that were made were controlled by the party, but party members could be ejected if they didn't go along the lines of the proletarian wants, and there could be recalls of members being voted out of the Soviets that did have power at the local levels and the centralized levels. And so yeah, because of these things, that's why the USSR was a dictatorship of the proletariat. So then next, Xexizy claims that socialism in Russia was impossible because of the majority peasant situation, and people wouldn't know what best suits their needs, so they would be walked all over by the party members. And this basically implies that the USSR was, never socialist. However, for the notion that the USSR wasn't planned in the interests of the workers, you really only have to look at the facts of what actually happened. So basically, the USSR guaranteed employment, allowed workers to control their workplaces to the highest extent possible, as to guarantee their satisfaction at work, gave citizens a right to health care, and a right to education. Why would any of this be true if the workers didn't have power in the USSR? And why would there be a state being controlled by the workers, as I explained earlier, if the USSR wasn't socialist? Like, what do you think a socialist country looks like? Like, what alternative would you propose as to what the Soviets did? Like, I really can't think of any other way that you could organize it and still have it be considered socialist. You just want the workers to own the means of production? That's just like market socialism. That would just be a bunch of worker co-ops. That's not what socialism is. It's a mode of production, and to do that, you have to have a somewhat of a central state to change the mode of production. That would eventually wither away with classes, but that does not mean that the government would wither away, because a state is a tool of class domination. It does not simply refer to an organizing body of society. That would obviously always exist, but the class domination part would wither away as full communism came. So I just wanted that to be clear. So next, Xexizy says that Lenin didn't think socialism was possible in Russia, and that he just thought that, Russia would be used as, a buffer during the European revolutions, and he was basically waiting for a European revolution to be successful. However, this is just wrong. To quote Lenin from his speech at the plenary session of the Moscow Soviet on November 20th, 1922, socialism is no longer a matter of the distant future, or an abstract picture. Permit me to conclude by expressing the conviction that, difficult as this task may be, new as it may be compared with our previous task, and no matter how many difficulties it may entail, we shall all, not in one day, but in the course of several years, all of us together fulfill it, whatever happens, so that NEP Russia will become Socialist Russia. And 1922, that was several years after the European revolutions had already failed, and most people had already dealt with this and had moved on, basically. So then, next, Xexizy claims that by the time the workers did have the knowledge to participate in democracy, whatever that means, I don't really know what constitutes them having the knowledge to participate in democracy, the USSR had already degenerated into the, quote, bureaucratic clusterfuck that we all know today. This once again implies that the USSR wasn't democratic, which I've already established that it was, and that the economy wasn't planned for the workers, when in reality it was, as I explained earlier. And in order for you to claim that the USSR wasn't socialist and it was just this bureaucratic, centralized state that was hated by all of its people, you would have to establish that there was a class that was benefiting in large profits by owning the means of production from a class that it was controlling. And this simply wasn't the case. I mean, the state planners did not benefit from planning the state a certain way, and the party officials were not the highest paid people in society. I mean, sure, you could argue under Crucifite revisionism that the party degenerated and corrupted because of the errors of the Stalin administration. Obviously, you'd have to criticize a lot of the things that he did, but to say that it was just like it was state capitalist or something like that, you would have to establish that there were different classes and that the workers were alienated from the means of production when they weren't, especially through the trade union system that the USSR had, as I've talked about in previous videos, as well as explained lightly in this one. So then, lastly, Xexizy takes a little jab at Stalin, where he basically says that Stalin ruled the Eastern Bloc with an iron fist, when in reality, many of the Eastern Bloc countries actually had autonomy and lots of socialist policies that benefited their workers, and they all had democracies. I mean, this is most seen in countries like Romania and Yugoslavia that basically turned their backs on the USSR and said, we aren't going to be associated with you anymore. And also with Afghanistan, which lasted, a year after the Union fell. So, yeah. And also, to claim that the USSR was like a social imperialist because of the way that they extracted money from the Eastern Bloc countries after the war, yeah, that happened, and that wasn't necessarily desirable. However, this isn't enough for them to be considered imperialist, because they weren't furthering capitalist markets, and they weren't exploiting the people of those countries. They were just kind of taking money from those countries to pay for war debts. And so that's not enough to call the USSR state capitalist. So in conclusion, going off the assumption that Xexizy is a trot, it is clear that he really doesn't understand basic Leninist theory, or at least he didn't at this point. Perhaps he's learned a little bit more. I would hope he's learned a little bit more at this point. And I just want to emphasize that, because I hear this all the time, that there is no phase where the state takes control of the means of production and then hands them to the workers, because the state owning the means of production is really the same as the workers owning them, especially when the workers are represented by the state and are represented in the state planning committees and are able to plan their own enterprises via the trade union system. To advocate this rapid decentralization that lots of trots seem to desire, and especially councilists, that would just be a detriment to the whole idea of a planned economy, because you need to have some sort of centralization for there to be a central plan. How do you think a planned economy works without a plan? If all enterprises are off doing their own things, then that's basically the same thing as capitalism, and you can't have that in a socialist society. So, yeah. So those are my thoughts on Xexizy's why the Russian Revolution failed. I'll leave all my sources in the description, as well as a script that I was basing this video off of. And, yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.